Hello class, and welcome to the module on parties. Okay, so nowhere in the Constitution it doesn't mention parties. Parties were definitely not on the founders' agenda. In fact, the founders viewed parties as dangerous, as a danger, a threat to good government. They remembered, that they had in mind the knowledge of the contentious factions and conflict in England over religion, how that prevented good government for centuries, how in fact it was a conflict between factions that brought down ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So they definitely thought that factions and party organizations were something to be avoided, and they were not mentioned in the Constitution whatsoever. But instead, the founders were hoping for enlightened statesmen to represent, the interests of their constituents and come together in legislative bodies that had checks and balances, but didn't necessitate parties, right? We didn't want to be empowering factions. However, we know that ended up not being the case. We know from class that from the very, very get-go, there was vehement disagreement between, two groups, essentially, about what the role of government should be, what the power of the national government should be. And this conflict created a necessity for coalitions. It ultimately created the necessity for parties, because parties offered the opportunity, they were used to coalesce power and to, protect power within legislating, to protect legislative power. And so those who were founding these initial coalitions, these parties, were hoping that they'd be temporary, but they did see them as a sort of temporary necessity. The thing is, while many would argue that parties are necessary for American government, for American democracy to work, the founders were wrong. They were anything but temporary.
Okay, let's dive into some slides here. So political parties, and Kernell calls these the Constitution's unwanted offspring, which is funny, but it's also quite apt, because we know that, like we just talked about, the founders were not so keen on political parties. In fact, Thomas Jefferson stated, "If I could not get to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all," right? And now we know, though, that Thomas Jefferson was essentially kind of like the party chair, or the leader, the party leader of the Democratic Republicans, one of the first two parties to come into being. And so the question becomes, why are parties happening despite the fact that the founders and those in the political elite at the time of the founding do not really want them to become a part of American democracy? And the answer to that question is related to incentives, right? The incentives to create parties, the power and the use of parties, the way that they are expedient makes them just too much to say no to, right? And so we know that parties there are strong incentives to party building, right? But what are these incentives exactly? Well, the first is related to alliances. Parties help build stable legislative and electoral alliances, right? Because what is, intrinsic into the Constitution is the necessity of majorities. Majorities are the only way that governing occurs. And so the first parties appeared in Congress when leaders with opposing visions of the nation's future began competing for majorities, for legislative votes. And everyone just voting on different interests was not enough to create a majority. Alliances needed to happen. And so organized competition for votes in Congress and ultimately leads directly to organized competitions for votes in elections. And this is because in order to get majorities in Congress to pass legislation, elected officials and the political elites start to recognize that we need to get more people elected that agree with us. And so these sorts of coalitions that ultimately become parties in the legislature ultimately go then to elections, right? Because elections and legislating are, as we know, directly connected all the way through. So once parties start existing, kind of coalitions around particular interests in the first Congress with regards to the role of government, once these coalitions start building in the legislature, they then start developing in terms of mobilizing the electorate as well, right? So it stems not just from Congress, but also extends into elections. And in order to create these parties, it required negotiating and maintaining electoral, coalitions, expanding parties, and then expanding into electoral parties. And the presidential selection rules also offered compelling reasons for building electoral alliances across districts and states, because they needed also, once again, to reach majorities about who would be the candidate for president. And so all of these different, collective action coordination problems required parties in many respects in order for everyone to kind of get together and coordinate. Now, in turn, another incentive for party building is with respect to mobilizing voters. So electoral alliances fail if they can't get enough people to vote for their candidates, right? We can't get majorities in Congress unless we can mobilize voters and make sure that people vote for our candidates. And so the competition for votes motivates alliance leaders to attract voters and get them to the polls. It makes the kind of attractiveness of a party organization even stronger. Now, in the beginning, it was mobilizing voters was not that ambitious of a project because most politics were local, right? But as the size of the electorate increased over time, so did the task of identifying and attracting supporters, figuring out who could be part of your, electoral coalition to mobilize voters, and getting them to, get out the vote and get more people to show up at the polls. And so the larger the electorate became, the more necessary these party organizations become in terms of trying to make sure that people can elect majorities into Congress. And again, this has to do once again then with organization. Okay, so once they're organized, these electoral parties initiated new relationships with different electoral leaders and with voters. And party organizers turned to mass communications to excite voters with emotional appeals on issues. So the party organization ability to get out the vote now, the organizational capacity, this is kind of like path dependency. Once the structure and the institution is there and functioning, then people become reliant on it, and it grows and it grows and it grows. Now, as it grows, it creates voter queues. Those who are, voters on the ground who are participating in elections now can rely on the parties and the party labels to tell them what different candidates believe in. What are their principles? What are their policy initiatives, right? What can we expect from this candidate and that candidate? These voter cues are like shorthand, right? They're very good cognitively for voters to understand their choices. They offer, cues to keep voting decisions simple and cheap, right? To think about two different candidates in terms of all of their different policy proposals and all of their history and their background and their speeches without these sort of shorthand labels of party identification, it takes a lot of time, right? That's expensive. There's a lot of cost associated with doing research on two candidates and then making an informed decision. So what party labels do is they kind of cheapen that whole process for the voter. They make it quick and easy. They say, this is generally speaking what this candidate's about. They're a Republican. And this is generally speaking what this candidate is about. They're Democrat, right? It's helpful. It's a quick shorthand cue for voters, right? And it allows, the more accurately a candidate's label predicts their behavior in office, the more useful it is to voters and the more it will be continued to be used. So, parties' strength comes from their ability to make sure that their candidates, once elected, do what the party wants. And the fact that voters rely on party cues in order to understand what elected officials will do makes this sort of reinforcing, self-enforcing cycle between the party and the candidates, you see? So it's just sort of incentives end up strengthening and institutionalizing the existence of parties. We can't even help it, right? They're just too expedient. They allow voters to reward and punish elected officials for their performance based on party, right? And so that threat of collective punishment gives the majority party a strong incentive to govern in ways that please the voters. And so in that way, it can be enhancing for democracy. Now, all of these incentives, as we talk about, they're reinforcing, right? Voters depend on the cues, and then the parties make sure that elected officials need to be associated with a party in order to be elected, right? Because they need voters to understand where they stand. And the organization, the mass communication helps voters understand, helps those who are running for office campaign better. So they need the party. It helps them mobilize voters. They need the party. And ultimately, these party organizations in Congress help majorities exist and thus governing happen, right? So because they're so expedient, they continue to be so useful to politicians and voters. That's why they endure, right? And so these incentives for organizing and expanding both legislative and electoral coalitions to win and exercise political power make parties continue to persist despite many kind of criticisms of the two-party system. But this two-party system, why does it exist this way? We get a lot of questions about that, and a lot of political scientists have considered it quite deeply. And, it relates to the basic features of our American electoral system, right? So elections in the United States have almost always been a winner-take-all affair, and we've talked about this. It's first past the post. Whoever gets the most votes wins, and all the other votes for any other candidates essentially don't see very strong representation in office. So the rules have continually worked to reduce the viable options to two. And this all relates to what's known as Duverger's law.
Okay, let's talk Duverger's law, right? Who is this guy? What is he talking about? So, Duverger was a French political scientist who proposed something really important and a big contribution to the way we understand elections and party systems. So one of the things he was thinking about was that why are there two-party systems so dominant in places like the United States? Places like where we have a winner-take-all voting system. Well, it's not because there's limited variation in our political interests. In fact, it's because of the way we vote. So let's work this out. Consider me as a voter, right? Now, there's 3 candidates out there running for president. Candidate 1, candidate 2, and candidate 3. He's got shorter legs, but it's very tall. Okay, so here are my preferences. I love candidate 2. Love candidate 2. Love, love, love this candidate. I think she is superb. I love her and I really want her to win, except she's in a very small party, right? She's not in a very big, powerful party. She's a third party candidate. So there is that. Number 1, don't have very good, strong feelings about, but I can get behind some of the things that candidate 1 is saying. So, okay, kind of. I'll put a big check mark here, right? But when it comes to candidate number 3, I do not like candidate number 3. Candidate 3 is a no-go. I do not want candidate 3 to win. I do not like her. So candidate 1, 3, big X. So now I'm going to vote. Now, I love candidate 2, but am I going to vote for candidate 2? Well, the fact of the matter is, it's a winner-take-all voting system. So if I vote for 2 and I know that candidate 2 is not going to get that many votes, candidate 2 is probably not going to win. And if my candidate doesn't win, then it's effectively like my vote didn't count, right? And, I know candidate 1 can put up a good fight against candidate 3, who I really do not want to win, right? So if I vote for candidate 2 and candidate 3 ends up winning, not only did my vote not count, but I didn't want her to win at all. I could have theoretically done something to stop her success, right? So yeah, candidate number 1 is not my favorite, but it's definitely the one that I think has the best likelihood of winning. So I'm going to vote strategic voting, right? So I'm actually going to end up voting for candidate number one. Now, this is what at the crux of Duverger's law is strategic voting, because what ends up happening is that because people do not want their votes to not count, they'll vote for the candidate they believe will win, even over the candidate they definitely love. Okay, and ultimately, voters with the candidates, like candidate number 2, is going to start thinking, my chances of winning are better if I align myself with the candidate number 1's party. Because, yeah, I mean, they fall kind of in line with what I think. It's not exactly how I believe, but they can do me service. If I join this strong party, it'll help me get elected, right? And what's more, the party leaders in Party 1 are thinking, okay, why don't we figure out how we can kind of co-opt candidate number 2 into our party, right? Because then we get all these guys like me who are definitely going to vote for candidate number 2, but don't necessarily feel that great about our party, right? We can kind of co-opt them into our big tent party and, expand our voter base. And so, let's say this can happen obviously with Party 3 as well, but ultimately what ends up happening is that we are left with two party system. Now, in places like Australia or Germany, where they have proportional representation, that's not what's going to happen, because if I were to vote for candidate number 2, then, maybe a bunch of my friends did as well, which represented not a majority of the population, but let's say 15-20% of the population ended up voting for candidate number 2. Then candidate number 2 and that party would have representation at least in a legislative body. But that's not how elections work in the United States. And because it's this winner-takes-all approach, then it has it's not like anyone is saying there has to be a two-party system. It's just that that's what naturally occurs because of the way the rules are set up, right? So nobody's doing it, except for we're all doing it, because these are the incentives laid out before us. And so it's similar to how parties happen, even though the founders didn't want them to happen at all. Because the incentives were there to make it the best way to get what we wanted, right? It's useful, it's expedient. And thus, for that reason, not just parties, but two-party systems, at least in this country, persist. So that's gonna close things off for this video. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of the party system and the kind of different stages of parties in the United States. So stay tuned, and I can't wait to see you on Monday.